A devout family torn apart by tragedy, a reality show that glimpsed the cracks, and a son who committed the unthinkable. In just a few minutes everything changed. 2 lives ended. 1 survived. But no one ever truly recovered. The Stockdale family was often portrayed as the embodiment of strict, wholesome American values. They were deeply religious, homeschooled their children, played bluegrass music together, and enforced rigid rules designed to keep the outside world at bay. Their home, tucked away in a rural part of Ohio, operated more like a carefully controlled environment than a typical household. There were no televisions, no video games, no dating, and certainly no secular music. Every element of life was meticulously structured. For outsiders, this appeared to be a family focused on faith, tradition, and discipline. But for those living within those walls, especially the children, it was a different reality, one ruled by fear, silence, and constant emotional surveillance. Jacob Stockdale was the second youngest son in this family. He played the fiddle in the family's bluegrass band and was often described as soft-spoken, intelligent, and deeply respectful. Yet there was a visible weight in his eyes that few noticed. Even during the family's 2008 appearance on the reality show Wife Swap, viewers caught unsettling glimpses beneath the family's composed surface. In that episode, the Stockdales swapped their mother with Lori Tonkovic, a woman from a far more relaxed and open-minded household. What was meant to be an entertaining clash of values instead gave the world a chilling window into what life was like inside the Stockdale home. Lori Tonkovic recalled one particularly disturbing moment involving Jacob. When she tried to explain to him that in her household, children were allowed to date, watch television, and enjoy typical teenage activities, Jacob broke down in tears. Not because he was being disrespected, but because he believed that doing such things would condemn him to hell. He feared eternal punishment for merely entertaining the idea of a life different from the one his parents had designed for him. That level of fear wasn't normal. It was deep-seated, as if it had been carved into his mind from an early age, and it exposed how intensely the Stockdale children had internalized their parents' dogma. Despite their public image, the family's internal dynamics raised more questions than answers. Catherine Stockdale, the matriarch, was strict but warm in the public eye. She was portrayed as a mother who simply wanted to protect her sons from a corrupt world. But her version of protection blurred into suffocation. Every decision, every interaction was overseen and approved. There was no room for individuality, no space for error. And when one grows up in an environment where making a mistake means moral failure, or worse, eternal damnation, the psychological pressure can become unbearable. Jacob, who was just a teenager when Wife Swap aired, didn't show any visible signs of rebellion back then. But emotional breakdowns like the one he had with Lori were warning signs, small cracks in a carefully built facade. He was the product of extreme isolation, his worldview shaped not by personal experience but by his parents' unyielding beliefs. Over the years, he continued to live within that rigid structure, even as he became a young adult. While other young men were exploring college, relationships, and personal freedom, Jacob remained embedded in his family's system. He had no girlfriends, no known social life outside of the band, and no digital footprint. On paper he was obedient. In reality he was imploding. Those close to the family said Jacob had always been sensitive, a quiet boy who didn't cause trouble. But that quietness may have been misinterpreted. It wasn't tranquility, it was repression. He had learned early on that questioning his parents or expressing discomfort with their rules would be met with spiritual guilt, not support. Over time, that silence became his coping mechanism. And in that silence, something began to fester, something that no one saw coming, not even his own family. What the world failed to recognize was that Jacob had never been given the tools to handle the complexities of adult life outside of the family ideology. He had never developed emotional independence. He had no outlet for frustration, confusion, or grief. And more importantly, he had no ability to escape without destroying the image that had been built around him. That kind of emotional trap doesn't always result in visible outbursts. Sometimes it simmers, quietly, until it finally breaks. Years after the Wife Swap episode aired, the Stockdales slowly faded from public view. But behind closed doors, Jacob was struggling. It wasn't clear to outsiders. There were no police calls, no school records, no behavioral incidents. Just a calm, soft-spoken young man living with his family and performing in a band. But internally he had begun to unravel. By the time the tragedy occurred in 2017, Jacob was 25 years old. He was still living at home, still playing music, still under the shadow of a belief system he had never chosen. The signs were there all along. moments of breakdown, isolation, suppressed emotion, but no one knew how far they had taken root. No one saw that Jacob wasn't coping anymore. He was collapsing under years of control, fear, and the overwhelming burden of a life he had never been allowed to question. It was a quiet afternoon on June 15, 2017, in the serene countryside of Beach City, Ohio. The Stockdale household sat tucked away, surrounded by open land and silence, a place that rarely saw disruption. But that day everything changed in an instant. A single chilling 911 hang-up call came from the Stockdale residence, prompting a police response. There was no voice on the other end, no cry for help, just silence. When officers arrived, they could never have prepared themselves for what waited behind the doors of the home that once symbolized purity and religious devotion. Inside the house, officers found a gruesome scene. Two bodies, those of 54-year-old Catherine Stockdale and her 21-year-old son James, lay lifeless, both shot with a 20-gauge shotgun. The home, once filled with the sounds of bluegrass music and prayer, now echoed only with death. Blood was spattered across the floor. The air was heavy with the unmistakable scent of gunfire and stillness. And in another part of the house was Jacob Stockdale, the 25-year-old son and musician, barely clinging to life. He had turned the gun on himself, shooting himself in the head in an apparent attempt to die alongside the family members he had just murdered. The scene shocked not only law enforcement but also the tight-knit local community. This wasn't a troubled household. There were no police records of domestic issues, no history of violence. The Stockdales had always been known for their clean living, polite demeanor, and strict Christian values. But now those values were drenched in blood, and the person responsible was the very boy who had once wept on national television over the fear of breaking his family's moral code. As investigators combed through the house, they found no signs of a struggle. There was no forced entry, no outside threat. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. It was a calculated execution carried out by someone who had shared dinner and laughter with the victims countless times before. The murder weapon was found nearby, a family-owned shotgun. It was legal, registered, and had likely been used for farm or hunting purposes in the past. But in Jacob's hands, it had become an instrument of irreversible destruction. Neighbors and friends were stunned. No one could make sense of what had happened. In the days that followed, media descended upon the Stockdale farm. Reporters unearthed the family's wife swap episode, replaying footage that once seemed odd and amusing but now felt haunting. They watched as Jacob, the same boy who now lay in critical condition, cried over the idea of being exposed to video games and casual relationships. They noted his discomfort with the outside world, his rigid adherence to religious rules, and his reluctance to even speak his own mind. It all took on a new, chilling context. The timeline of the murders was short but deliberate. Authorities believe Jacob shot his mother first. Catherine was reportedly found in the upstairs area, indicating she may have been ambushed without warning. Then he turned the gun on James, his younger brother, who was likely downstairs. James was the most outgoing of the siblings, known for being cheerful and deeply involved in the family band. Some speculate that James may have wanted more independence, or perhaps had talked about leaving home, though that remains unconfirmed. What is certain is that Jacob did not flee after the killings. Instead, he turned the shotgun on himself, a move that suggested remorse or a desire to escape the consequences, or perhaps simply to end the unbearable psychological pain he had been carrying for years. Miraculously, Jacob survived the gunshot wound to his head. Emergency services rushed him to the hospital, where he remained in critical condition for months. The bullet had damaged parts of his skull and brain, requiring intensive surgery and a long road to recovery. While he lay unconscious, the world speculated. Was this the result of a mental break? Was Jacob insane, or had years of control and emotional repression finally erupted in violence? In those initial months there were no answers. Jacob couldn't speak. He couldn't explain what he had done or why. The surviving members of the Stockdale family, his father Tim and two older brothers, retreated into privacy, shattered by the unimaginable loss and confusion. Friends described them as stunned, trying to grieve but haunted by the unanswered questions that hung over everything. Law enforcement began assembling a profile, interviewing relatives, neighbors, and mental health experts. They looked into Jacob's behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders, searching for any clue that could offer insight. But there was little to go on. Jacob had no criminal record, no drug use, no erratic behavior. He had seemed from the outside to be the same quiet, rule-following young man he had always been. But behind the silence was something darker. Perhaps he had felt trapped, unable to express fear or confusion. Perhaps he resented the life that had been imposed upon him. Or maybe he simply broke, mentally and emotionally, under the weight of expectations he never chose. Whatever the reason, 2 lives were gone, and the boy who had once feared dancing with a girl at a birthday party had committed an act of unthinkable violence that would forever stain his family's legacy. As Jacob Stockdale slowly regained consciousness in his hospital bed, a whirlwind of questions surrounded him. His head was heavily bandaged, his movements sluggish, and his future uncertain. He had survived a self-inflicted shotgun blast to the head, something few ever do. But with that survival came the burden of accountability. Why had he killed his own mother and younger brother? What could have pushed him, a quiet young man from a devout and seemingly loving family, to such a brutal act? The world wanted answers, but Jacob remained silent, physically unable to speak for months due to his injuries, and emotionally sealed off by years of repression and religious rigidity. Investigators waited, psychologists circled, and the legal system held its breath. While Jacob recovered, professionals conducted mental evaluations, probing the depths of his fractured mind. He had no criminal record, no drug abuse, no signs of prior aggression. Yet something had broken inside him, something profound enough to lead to murder. Early evaluations suggested signs of mental illness, possibly a psychotic break, but that wasn't enough to explain the sheer violence and focus of the attack. People wanted to believe it was temporary madness, that this wasn't the real Jacob. But that narrative was too simple, too neat. As time passed and Jacob's physical health improved, the courts began to push for answers. He was charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder, and his defense team initially entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. It was a logical move. After all, how could someone so isolated, so emotionally suffocated, possibly understand the full gravity of their actions? But the prosecution didn't see it that way. They saw a man who had deliberately killed 2 members of his family with clear intent. A man who had waited until others were out of the house. A man who had not acted in blind rage, but with terrifying calculation. What emerged during the legal process were chilling details that painted a portrait of a mind unraveling. Family acquaintances recalled moments where Jacob seemed increasingly distant in the months before the murders. He had withdrawn even further into himself, becoming more solemn, more rigid in his behavior. Some speculated he had been battling internal demons for years, demons born not from external influence, but from an upbringing that allowed no room for emotional exploration or psychological vulnerability. He had grown up in a home where fear of eternal punishment overshadowed everything, where failure to conform wasn't just a mistake, it was a moral failing. One voice that rang especially loud during this time was that of Lori Tonkovic, the woman who had once switched places with Catherine Stockdale on Wife Swap. She gave interviews after the murders, recounting her experience with the Stockdales. She remembered how Jacob had cried when exposed to simple freedoms like dating or listening to music. He was terrified, not of Lori herself but of what her presence represented. Change. Temptation. A threat to the structure he had been raised to believe was the only path to salvation. Lori had sensed something dark even back then. That boy is not okay, she recalled thinking at the time. But no one had listened, or perhaps no one had truly understood what those tears meant. By the time Jacob was declared competent to stand trial, the tone of the proceedings shifted. It was no longer just about mental health, it was about accountability. Jacob's silence continued, but his lawyers negotiated a plea deal. In 2021, more than 4 years after the murders, Jacob Stockdale pleaded guilty to both killings. The court sentenced him to 2 concurrent prison terms of 15 years to life. It wasn't a sensational outcome. There were no dramatic testimonies, no tearful apologies. Just a quiet acceptance of guilt and a future that would now be spent behind bars. But for many the case didn't end there. Questions lingered in the air like smoke. Had Jacob been a victim long before he became a perpetrator? Was he a dangerous man who snapped, or a tormented soul who had never been given the tools to process his own thoughts and emotions? The psychological debate sparked public discourse about the dangers of extreme parenting, emotional repression, and religious indoctrination. Could such an environment have quietly fractured Jacob's mind until he reached a point of no return? Even now, years later, no definitive motive has been confirmed. Jacob himself has never publicly spoken about why he did it. The closest anyone has come to an answer lies in the subtle pieces left behind. The interviews with family friends, the chilling contrast between the Stockdales' public image and their private reality, the way Jacob clung to religious purity while his own identity dissolved under pressure. He had lived a life where emotion was feared, curiosity was condemned, and silence was the safest language. In the end, what happened inside that Ohio farmhouse was not just a crime, it was a collapse. A collapse of structure, of faith, of control. Jacob Stockdale, the boy who had once cried over worldly influence, became the very symbol of what happens when emotion is buried instead of understood. He didn't just destroy his family. He exposed a haunting truth, that even in the most seemingly devout homes, the deepest horrors can be quietly growing unnoticed, until they finally explode.